Okay, good morning everybody, or afternoon or evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. So this is the lesson for today, Halting a Second Revolution, June 1933 to August 1934. It's a two-parter really. So today's lesson looks at the origin and events of the event that was famously called the Night of the Long Knives, which happened on the 30th of June 1934. Quick knowledge retrieval. Obviously pause the video because this is a video. I don't need to read the questions to you. You can just pause those yourself. I'll just pull it in a little bit. 11 questions and then the answers are on the next page. Remember, it's the whole point is about fingertip knowledge here, putting it into your long-term memory. So some of those questions go back a long time. Deeper knowledge, they go back to depth study 2, the questions that you've got there. Deeper knowledge, some are from last month about the Gleichschaltung process, and then these are from last lesson. And there's the big picture. Okay, so we're working through depth study 3, and we've been focusing in on the creation of a totalitarian state. And this is, I say, part 3 of a 3-parter. We began by looking at the National Uprising, and then we looked at the Enabling Act and the process of Gleichschaltung of the working class organisations and the political parties in the states. And now, in this lesson, we're looking at the problem of the SA and how Hitler resolved this particular problem. So make sure you, over time, have a plan to deepen your knowledge, and this all helps put it into your long-term memory. So William Carr is very, very good. His Notes and Pridham Volume 1, the final chapter, chapter 5, called The Seizure of Power. There's a big picture, okay, so you can sort of see today's lesson and next lesson, which I think is Wednesday. Next lesson we'll look at the outcome, but today's lesson we're picking up this event. Notice the date, 30th of June 1934, and we begin in the summer of 1933, 12 months earlier, okay, and we'll follow the train of events through to what actually happened on that night. And then in Wednesday's lesson we will continue after June 1934 and look at the consequences of it. Now, a quick recap. Okay, some key knowledge from the last few lessons that are relevant to today's lesson. Just a reminder for you of what Gleichschaltung was. Okay, so all of those we've covered in the past. So the forcible coordination of German life, okay, over a year from 30th of January to 30th of January 1934. A key part of that was the suspension of civil liberties. That was very much the Reichstag fire decree of the 28th of February 1933, and the legal dismantling of the Weimar Constitution, in particular the removal of the powers of the Reichstag, and lawmaking was now focused on Hitler, and that was the Enabling Act of the 24th of March 1933. And then Hitler used those powers through the process of Gleichschaltung, okay, firstly to abolish the powers of the other political parties, so he got rid of a pluralist democracy. Secondly, to crush the powers of the trade unions, to bring the working classes under control. And thirdly, to abolish the powers of the other states, which included bringing the policing of Germany under central control, in other words, Hitler's government in Berlin. And that ties to that date there, that process formally was concluded with the law of the 30th of January 1934, which was exactly a year after Hitler became Chancellor. And that whole process is often known as the legal revolution, okay, or if you wish, the first revolution, okay. But the thing to remember when we talk, you come across this phrase, the second revolution. The second revolution never happened, okay. The second revolution is what the SA leadership, in particular Ernst Röhm, wanted to happen, but Hitler didn't, and Hitler basically resolved that issue on the night of the Long Knives a year later, in June 1934, by having the SA leaders removed, okay, murdered. He nipped it in the bud so that there wouldn't be a second revolution. So it's understanding what that second revolution was, okay. The other thing is that there were exceptions to Gleichschaltung. Not all aspects of German life were brought under Nazi control in 1933 to 34, and to a large extent that was Hitler's choice. Okay, Hitler, if he had wanted to, could have, for example, have coordinated the industrialists or the business community, but he didn't want to do that. Okay, why? Because these people were right-wing people. They shared his views, and they had put him into power in the first place. And because Hitler needed them, okay? And if Hitler sort of basically coordinated them, he used force to bring them into line, which was not really necessary because they supported him anyway, then it would just result in pushback, okay, resistance from them. And Hitler wanted them to be willing partners because their expertise was valuable to him. So he wanted them to continue to believe that they were independent, working independently in partnership with the Nazis, rather than brought under their control, okay? So to maintain the illusion of independence, and it's understanding that that's really important. And so why did he need to keep them working with them and independent of his full control? Well, the industrialists and the business community, they were right-wing, they were nationalists, they wanted a strong government, but they were essential for Germany's economic recovery. Remember, there were 6 million Germans who were unemployed, and those 6 million Germans expected Hitler to create jobs. And that was essential for Hitler's long-term popularity. Okay, if Hitler's going to sort of maintain his long-term power, he needs to be popular with the German people. Okay, he needs to get the German people admiring him. We'll develop that theme in a later lesson. And secondly, Hitler wants to rearm Germany. Okay, remember Germany's army is being restricted by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men, and he needs to build up weapons because in Hitler's head, largely hidden from these conservative backers, in Hitler's head, his real long-term plan is to wage war to conquer land in the east for living space. Okay, Hitler believes that Germany's frontiers are too constrictive, that he needs to push Germany's frontiers, particularly her eastern frontiers with Poland and then Russia beyond that, the Soviet Union, because Germany, in Hitler's mind, a racially superior nation, deserves to have more land for the people to live on. Okay, and to wage war to conquer territory requires a strong army. Building up a strong army requires the industrialists to make the weapons for him. Okay, and lo and behold, it also creates jobs which will build up popular support because Hitler will be solving the unemployment problem at the same time. So it all sort of like works together neatly. The other thing to remember, of course, is waging war successfully needs to have a good army. It's not just about having lots of weapons. And what Hitler has inherited is the best army in the world. Okay, the German, we've covered that. I don't need to backtrack over it. Remember Mirabeau we quoted the philosopher Mirabeau, who talked about Prussia as not as a country with an army, but as an army with a country, which is kind of a reference to the fact that Germany was created out of Prussia, and Prussia was a military machine, and that sort of like the importance of this highly professional discipline, the best army in Europe, continued throughout the Second Reich into the Weimar Republic. And Hitler, when he became Chancellor in 1933, he had the best army in Europe. It was a right-wing army, it was nationalist, it shared Hitler's beliefs to an extent, but they were not Nazis, they were conservative backers of Hitler. Okay, and so he needed that military expertise, and he doesn't want to lose that expertise by upsetting them in any way. And I think that is the crux of where we're going to go to this lesson. Okay, so because it was the SA that ended up upsetting the army. Okay, so who were the SA? Okay, we've mentioned before, so just pick up on the sort of key points. They were led by Ernst Röhm, okay, one of Hitler's oldest friends, loyal servant of the Nazi movement since the early 1920s. Okay, so since 1920, they always played a key role in the Nazi movement. Now, again, we've covered this in the past, so I don't want to go into too much detail here. But in 1923, remember, Hitler tried to use the SA to take power violently by marching on Berlin, and didn't go anywhere, and it all fell apart because there's a clear message from the Weimar authorities that they would not support Hitler in any way if he used violence to take power. So Hitler then basically he was let out of jail, and he had to come up with a new strategy, and the new strategy was to find a legal pathway to power, which meant he basically had to tell the SA they were to put away, park it, parcel it up, and not use violence. And that was pretty tough for the SA, because what were the SA? Okay, the SA were Hitler's stormtroopers. They were the private army of the Nazi Party. Okay, they were the brown shirts. Don't confuse them with the SS, the black shirts. They were very, very different. Okay, and we'll do more about that at the very end of this lesson, but also the start of the next lesson. Most of them were sort of ex-Freikorps, sort of like frontline trench fighters in World War I. Rough, tough men who, a bit like Hitler, sort of like had found a place in World War I, but never really fitted into peacetime life. So they enjoyed playing at being soldiers. But Hitler had said to them after 1923, you've got to put your guns away and just be marching ranks. Your role is a propaganda role. Okay, to help me get into power. You're going to be a display of strength. The voters will look at you and go, wow, Hitler, there is a party that has got the strength to sort out Germany's problems if that man takes power. And that was basically Hitler's message. Wait until I'm in power, then I'll let you off the leash. You can get your guns out again, and you can basically start using violence. And that's basically what happened in the first half of 1933. Hitler became Chancellor, and in a sense, he let them off the leash. It's like letting a wild dog off the leash. But the message was, go for the communists, go for the socialists, okay? Which they did. And they did this amazing job for Hitler. It impressed the conservatives. The communists were crushed. They found it impossible to campaign during the election campaign, the National Uprising election campaign. But then, on the 6th of July, again, I use this image, don't use this in the exam, it probably wouldn't be appropriate, but it's that image of a wild dog let off the leash. 6th of July, by July 1933, the work had been done, the communists were in concentration camps, the Social Democrats are either in concentration camps or they've gone abroad, the trade unions have been crushed, and then it's like, here boy, back on the lead, okay? And that moment, 6th of July kind of marked the beginning of a crisis that lasted for a whole year and was eventually resolved with the mad dog basically being put down, okay, or at least the leadership of it was. Because Hitler told them on the 6th of July 1933 they must cease their violent attacks once again. And that really frustrated this man, Ernst Röhm. Okay, so now we're at the beginning, and let's go to our mind map, and it's the usual thing. So we'll take one strand at a time. You've got the luxury, you can pause the video, do your mind mapping, have your mind map printed out and map the key points across. You don't even need to do it in one session. You can spend 2 days doing this and keep coming back to the video. You might want to do that, spend 10 minutes on each strand, something like that. Okay, but there's this big picture. So you've got a sense we've got quite a lot of information to get through in the next sort of probably will be about 45 minutes for this video to sort of like go through all of these points, which is why you might want to do it in sections over a day or two. Okay, and what we're going to do, a bit like you often see it in Hollywood films, don't you? You know how you watch a film and the first scene is actually the end scene of the film. It flashes forward briefly for 10 minutes, and then after that it goes back to the beginning. and it's 1 year, and we're going to do that here. We're going to flash forward to what actually happened in the end, and then we'll go back in time to the summer of 1933 and follow the story through. Okay. So what actually happened then on the night of the Long Knives? What happened on the June 1934? So there's our sort of picture of what we're doing. Okay, and there we are, and we're looking at the event here, which happened, notice the date, in June 34. Okay, Hitler became Chancellor in January 33, nearly a year and a half earlier. Okay, so we'll start with the event, which was a year and a half in, and then we'll go back to the summer of 1933 and follow through, and that's today. And then the next lesson, which will be Wednesday, we'll start with the event and we'll then go look at the impact, the consequences. Okay, so flash forward in a nutshell. So in a nutshell, in 1932 and early 1933, Hitler had been helped into power by the conservative elites. So I'm picking out key phrases here, you know about that, the conservative elites. Helped into power. Men like von Papen and the army leaders who persuaded Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. And as you know, in the first half of 1933, Hitler had implemented that legal revolution in which Germany became a one-party dictatorship. Okay. These conservative backers on the whole approved of what Hitler had achieved. They were right-wing like Hitler. Okay. The reason they had put Hitler into power was so that he could create a more authoritarian, there's another key word, system, closer to the style of the old Germany of the Second Reich. Remember, we talk about these people as being reactionaries. Okay. People who wanted to turn the clock back. And remember the day of Potsdam, how Hitler so cleverly presented himself as somebody who was going to do that for them. Okay, we of course know that Hitler was going to do a lot more. Hitler was not really wanting to turn the clock back. He wants to move it forwards and to create something much more radical. So restoring the old Germany. Okay, so that sort of brings our story up to the summer of 1933. Okay, so Hitler crushed the communists, he broke the powers of the trade unions, he's got the Enabling Act passed, he can now pass the laws without involving the Reichstag. On the whole, the Conservatives are happy with what he's done. Okay, they think that he's their puppet and he's creating a new type of Germany that's similar to the old Germany that they want to restore. But we then jump forward a year later, by the spring of 1934, these conservatives, but especially the senior army leaders and also von Papen, he was the previous chancellor, well, not the very previous, but two chancellors before Hitler, who the ultimate conservative, who had persuaded Hindenburg to make Hitler the chancellor. And part of the deal was von Papen was the vice chancellor. Okay, part of the boxing in, you may remember. Well, these people began to express concerns that Hitler's revolution had gone too far, and they were especially concerned about the behaviour of the stormtroopers, Hitler's private army, the brown shirts, and in particular what they believed was the excessive behaviour. He believed that this sort of like mad dog, that it hadn't really been fully brought under control, and that it was still out of control, and it needed to be reined in more fully, permanently, basically. In June 1934, after a whole year of indecision, now remember that, because our next topic will look at Hitler's style, and one of the big debates is that Hitler, was he actually a fairly inefficient leader? Okay, it took Hitler a long time to resolve this. Hitler decided to act to resolve the problem. So on the 30th of June 1934, what he did is he ordered the brutal murder of more than 400 SA leaders, including his longest, most loyal friend, Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA. In other words, Hitler had a decision. Who does he side with? Does he side with a Nazi organisation, the SA, which has served him very loyally, or does he side with a non-Nazi group of people, the conservatives, who put him into power? And Hitler sided with the conservatives. He sided with the non-Nazis against the Nazis. And that event is known as the Night of the Long Knives. Okay? The information that sits beneath that you need to pick up in your mind mapping. Okay? The occasion in which Hitler struck a deal with the conservatives, that probably the arrangement was made that Hitler made a promise, I will sort out the SA for you, was a meeting on a German battleship called the Deutschland that happened in April 1934. Okay, so make sure you put that onto your mind map. And the trigger, the immediate trigger, notice the date, 17th of June, 2 weeks before the Night of the Long Knives, the immediate trigger that probably prompted Hitler to take action in June 1934 was when von Papen, there he is, gave a speech at the University of Marburg. And in that speech, von Papen, speaking on behalf of the conservative nationalists, said, we are concerned about Hitler. We're concerned that Hitler is not sorting out the SA problem. And that worried Hitler. Okay, and that's why 2 weeks later, on the 30th of June, Hitler ordered the murder of Ernst Röhm and the other senior leaders. We don't know exactly how many people died, probably 400 roughly. Historians will argue, you get different figures in different books. Also, it wasn't just the SA leaders who were killed. Hitler used the occasion to settle old scores. People who basically he didn't like, who'd maybe caused him difficulties in the past, also died on that particular night. It kind of like really displayed Hitler's gangster methods, including the previous Chancellor, General Schleicher. He was murdered on that night. And one of Hitler's, again, most loyal members of the Nazi Party, a man called Gregor Strasser, who was in charge of the party organisation, had been a bit of a pain to Hitler, resisted, had his own views on certain aspects, but he was a loyal Nazi, but Hitler decided to have him murdered as well. Okay, so we've looked at that. We're now going to go back in time to look at the long-term reasons. So we're now going to go back to a year earlier and look at the behind that. Okay, so in a nutshell, okay, in the first year of his rule, Hitler had brought about, again, I'm going to focus in on the key terms. Hitler had brought about a legal revolution. Okay, and the key thing there is that the legal revolution was a political revolution. Okay, it was it had transformed the political power structure of Germany. It had abolished the power of the Reichstag and had transferred powers to Hitler and his cabinet in Berlin. Okay, but one of the important things is Hitler deliberately left the structure of society unchanged. So the legal revolution was a political revolution, but it was not a social revolution, because Hitler did not want to have the social pyramid changed. Now I'm going to pull back a little bit. There's our social pyramid there, and we've done that ever since 1871. That's how society was structured. It was a class society, and at the top you've got the Junkers, and you've got the industrial, you've got the old elites, and you've got the new elites at the top. Okay, and then in the middle you've got the lower middle classes, and you've got then the working classes at the bottom. The structure of society was not changed by Hitler. He actually wanted to keep society structured as it was. Okay, so let's just go back to our text. So the reason for this was that Hitler was dependent upon the upper part of the social pyramid. So there's our upper part of the social pyramid, the elites, the old elites there, and the new elites there. Okay, he was dependent upon them to achieve many of his medium-term objectives that we looked at a few minutes ago, especially creating jobs to resolve the unemployment problem, and for which he would need the backing of big business, and also for rearming Germany, making weapons, for which he would need the backing of the old elites, as well as the new elites. The new elites would make the weapons for him, but the old elites, the Prussian Junkers, are the leaders of the army, this great Prussian army. They're the generals, and including President Hindenburg himself is the commander-in-chief of the German army. So Hitler's decided, right, I need these people at the top of the pyramid. They're really important for my medium-term aims. They're not Nazis, but they are right-wing. But I'm going to string them along. They think I'm their puppet. Well, I'll let them continue to believe that. I'm not going to take them over the way I've taken over other aspects of German life, because I need them working willingly with me. Okay, so on the 6th of July 1933, Hitler gave this major speech to his own Nazi party, which included the SA, and he made very clear that he did not want that structure of society changing. Okay, the structure of society would remain the same. But Röhm, the leader of the SA, didn't like that. Röhm wanted to have that social pyramid changed. He wanted to change the structure of society, because what Röhm wanted was to get rid of the power of the elites. Okay, now that's because the membership of the SA, which was now more than 2 million strong, was largely drawn from the lower classes. Okay, and in particular, the lower middle classes. Okay, the artisans, the white-collar workers. And so the membership of the SA, drawn from the lower classes, was largely hostile to the rich, okay, and the powerful. And the SA had served Hitler well. They'd patiently waited for 10 years. And then in the first half of 1933, they crushed the left-wing threat of communism. They removed the Social Democrats. And now Röhm says, we want to be rewarded. We want jobs, and we want to be given jobs, the jobs that are controlled by the rich, the upper classes and the upper middle classes, to be given to us. Okay, so in other words, Röhm wanted to implement a social revolution. In other words, Röhm wanted a second revolution. The first revolution has happened, the legal revolution, the political revolution. Now I want a shake-up of society. Okay, so when you read on this, and the historians talk about a second revolution, it's referring to what Röhm wanted to happen. Okay, so there's a little diagram that sums it. I'm not going to read it to you, but just pause. You can pause the video and read it yourself, but it talks about the old elites there, the new elites there, and the SA there. Okay, so pause that and read it yourself. Make sure you're comfortable with it. That's really important, this particular slide. It's just consolidating and saying key points that I've already said in this video. So I'm not going to read it again to you, but read that yourself. Okay, so what was the so-called Second Revolution? Okay, so we've covered this. First revolution was the legal revolution, the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act, which brought much of German life under Nazi control. But Hitler, however, had maintained a tactical alliance. It's a nice phrase, that, tactical, with the conservative elites. They'd backed his rise to power, and he needed to keep their support. So the conservative elites continued to hold much political and economic power in the new Germany. They're at the top of that pyramid. Okay, but Röhm wasn't happy about that. Röhm took very seriously the left-wing aspects of the Nazi Party. Remember, the Nazi Party, the initials of it, NSDAP. Okay, fundamentally, they were nationalist and Deutsche, German, fundamentally right-wing. But the party name also included S, socialist, and A, Arbeiter, workers. Okay, and that was largely put in by Hitler to try to win the workers away from the cause of international socialism, to bring them behind the national flag. But Röhm took very seriously the S and the A, and he genuinely wanted the party to be a mass party that looked after the ordinary people. and cared for them against the bosses. Okay, and that's what basically Rome wants. He wants a second revolution which will remove the influence of the rich. Okay, and Rome is starting to think Hitler's selling out here. Rome basically doesn't like the well-off. He doesn't like the upper classes and the upper middle classes. Okay, he doesn't like the army leaders, the leading businessmen, these people. And Rome wants to reward his 2.5 million loyal SA men. He wants them with the top jobs in the army and industry, and that's what Rome wants, a social revolution. He's not happy just to have a legal revolution. It's not gone far enough. He wants a second revolution, a social revolution. And that worried Hitler. Okay, stormtrooper violence had been important. It had played a crucial role in the first 6 months of Hitler's power. It had been, like I say, this mad dog let loose, and it had been very useful in bringing the communists and the SPD under control and removing that threat. But the SA soldiers, typically from the bottom part of the pyramid, they resented the influence of the well-to-do groups. Okay, and Hitler was concerned that the violent behaviour of the SA soldiers would now be turned against his conservative backers. So on the 6th of July 1933, Hitler spoke to his party and he gave this very famous speech. And in that speech, and I put there learn by heart, okay, not the whole speech, but the phrase, he said, "The stream of revolution must now be guided into the safe channel of evolution." Okay, so he's saying we've had a revolution, a legal political revolution, but I do not want the revolution to now become a social revolution. It stops. We're keeping society structured the way it has been for the time being. Okay, so this massive change that we've just gone through for 6 months has been important, but we've now got to return to normality and society continues the way it has been. Okay. So there's Hitler's dilemma represented as a picture. Okay, notice I use that word reactionary, which is important. And there is the second strand and the first strand. Okay, so we're building up our mind map. So now let's go to Rome. Him. So, in a nutshell, Rome was extremely unhappy about that famous speech, 6th of July 33 speech. He felt that Hitler was selling out. Okay. Rome, as you said, took very seriously the left-wing aspects of the Nazi Party programme, and Hitler felt that the millions of loyal party members, including the SA, who were largely from the lower levels of society, because remember, Nazism at its grassroots was largely drawn from the white-collar workers and the artisans. And he felt these loyal supporters who backed Hitler should now be rewarded with jobs, and they should be taking the jobs from the rich and given to the loyal party members. Now, in particular, remember the SA was a private army, so part of this vision that Rome had was that the SA would form the nucleus of a future German army. And in Rome's head, he had in his mind the idea of the future German army that would wage war to take territory from Poland and Russia in the future would be the type of army that Napoleon had created 150 years earlier in the Napoleonic Wars. It would be a people's army. Hitler disagreed. Hitler, as we've said, had inherited the Prussian military machine, which was a small professional army. It was not Nazi, okay? They were not members of the Nazi Party, but they were backers of the Nazi movement. And what Rome wants is for the SA effectively to swamp, to take over the Prussian army, to expand it and to create a new type of army that's formed out of ordinary men from the lower ranks of society. The conservative backers of Hitler may not be Nazis, but in Hitler's head, they were military experts. The Prussian generals he needs to keep them. Hitler wanted to retain Prussian excellence in his future German army because he needs that Prussian excellence if he's going to achieve his expansionist plans, which may be 10 years down the line, but he needs to keep that professional Prussian army ticking and working the way it has done so effectively for hundreds of years. It had built Germany, it had created Germany in 1871. And Rome's plans of the SA becoming the new German army, and the old Prussian army is absorbed within the SA, doesn't really sit comfortably with Hitler's vision or with the Prussian generals themselves. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. So the detail underneath. Okay, we can pick out the key facts here. What was Rome's reaction? Okay, some nice little quotes there which you might want to add or memorize. Pick them out. It's useful to sort of like put little quotes into your essays, but some nice, this is all documented. At one point, Rome said Adolf is a swine. He will give us all away. He only associates with the reactionaries. Now, that's a nice one because it's got that key word. Adolf knows exactly what I want. I've told him often enough. Not a second edition of the old imperial army. Are we revolutionaries or aren't we? Okay. So Rome is seriously unhappy with Hitler following Hitler's speech of the 6th of July 1930. If we're revolutionaries, then something new must arise out of our elan, like the mass armies of the French Revolution. So that's a nice little quote because that's where he is clearly stating that the type of army he wants is a mass army similar to Napoleon's army 150 years before. There we are. He can't stand the Prussian generals. The generals are a lot of old fogies. They never had a new idea. The SA is the nucleus of the new army. Don't you see that? What's coming must be new, fresh, unused. We want to have a new type of army. The basis of the new German army must be revolutionary. Because what Hitler wants is to keep the old professional army, the army of the Second Reich. So there's a fundamental agreement there. So you only get the opportunity once to make something new and big. That'll help us lift the world off its hinges. But Hitler puts me off with fair words. So clearly he's concerned that Hitler is selling out, that Hitler is now prepared to dilute his radical aims by making political compromises with the upper classes. So the SA have played that vital year in the years of struggle. They've won the political battle in the streets. But clearly, Rome and the SA are now bitter at the way that Hitler's working closely and making compromises with the rich, who are not true Nazis, like he and his movement, who've been there since 1920. Okay, they're also embittered by the fact that they were not personally benefiting now that Hitler was in power. They're not being given the jobs for themselves. They've been told, go back home and you've done your bit. Disillusioned by the fact that all Hitler seemed to want of the SA was to go back just to being propaganda tools. So whenever Hitler gives speeches, they put their brown shirts on and they stand there and applaud Hitler and so on. Okay, so all of those sorts of factors. They've been useful to Hitler as an image of unity, discipline and strength, and clearly Hitler seems to be saying, going back to do that again. And they don't want that, they want reward. So what exactly was the second revolution that Rome now wants to happen? Okay, so SA membership was more working class than that of the Nazi Party. And when I say working class, I mean from the bottom part of the pyramid, so including the artisans and the Mittelstand, the lower middle class. So the SA took very much more seriously than Hitler remember the S and the A, ironically, NSDAP. They take seriously the socialist and the Arbeiter, okay, workers. I actually never thought of that. Those two letters make the SA. SA stands for Sturmabteilung, stormtroopers, but they took it very seriously. They were fundamentally anti-capitalist. they were quite left-wing in their views. They really believed strongly in the left-wing aspects of the party programme, whereas Hitler didn't. From Hitler's point of view, the left-wing aspects of the party programme were primarily put there as a ruse to sort of win the workers over to his cause. So Rome wanted the SA to integrate with the Reichswehr, to turn the Reichswehr, and there's that word, remember, you try using that word, that's the word for the German army, okay, into a people's army, of which he would be the commander. So Rome believed the legal or the first revolution, fine, but it's insufficient. It needs now to be supplemented with a social revolution, which will be a second revolution, okay. So Rome wants to complete the revolution by removing the upper class cronies, removing the swine from the Reichswehr leadership, replacing them with his own men. This is the so-called second revolution that Rome wants. He wants the SA to be rewarded. Instead of best, they were being told now to shadow the old bosses. That's it. It's like, this man is frustrated. The people are keeping their jobs. So, there could be a big business making weapons, a big factory down the road, and it's being run by industrialists, and they're not real Nazis. They never have been Nazis, okay? And Rome is saying, I want his job, or I want a loyal member of the SA to take on his job. But Hitler's saying, no, you keep an eye on him, keep an eye on that man. If he's not loyal, you can have his job. But if as long as he's doing a good job, let him keep it. And Rome's saying, well, that's not right, because this man's not a Nazi. This man running that factory or that business, he's not a true Nazi. He has not been there since I have been, since 1920. So a member of the SA should take over the running of his business. But Hitler's saying, no, shadow the business. Keep an eye on him. Okay, that's what we mean when we say about the shadow. So Rome wanted the SA soldiers not to shadow, but to actually take the top jobs in the country. But Hitler's saying, no, you can't have them. We'll develop that concept of shadowing in a lesson coming up soon when we look at the Nazi state and how it was. Okay, so why did Hitler not agree with Rome's call for the SA, for an SA takeover of the German army? Okay, is our next thing. So we've done 3 strands now. Now we need to then focus in on Hitler. Okay, and then we'll look at the key players, the murderers themselves, and then we're finished. So we're doing well. Okay, so again, as I said at the beginning, you may choose. There's quite a lot. There's a lot of information in this video. You don't need to sort of like play it all in one go. You can pause, and you should be pausing the video and going back to it, etc., etc. So Hitler. Okay, so we'll pull back in a nutshell. So in the late spring of 1934, as we've seen, Hitler is now increasingly concerned, okay, and worried. He's anxious. He's under pressure from the Conservatives. But there was another reason that he was concerned, okay? And he's now worried about President Hindenburg. Now, Hindenburg is the commander-in-chief of the Reichswehr, the German, i.e. the Prussian army. And the presidency and the Reichswehr was a key area of German life which Hitler had not yet brought under Nazi control. Okay, remember, Hitler has brought government under Nazi control. He's got rid of the power of the Reichstag, and he's got the power to make laws by himself. But above him is the head of state, the president. And President Hindenburg had been elected into that position in 1925. He's still there. And the president has got the power to dismiss the chancellor, okay, to sack him. And Hitler, okay, he's got the power to say no, but Hitler doesn't want that to happen, because the problem is the president is the commander-in-chief of that great Prussian army. So if Hitler gets into a conflict with President Hindenburg, then Hitler will end up in conflict with the great German army that he needs. So Hitler's got to play this one very carefully. Another concern for Hitler was President Hindenburg was an old man in his mid-80s. He was old. And by the time, the spring of 1934, This is the time when it's all coming to a head, when Hitler's having those meetings on the Deutschland boat with the generals, and von Papen is speaking out at the University of Marburg. It was fairly clear that Hindenburg was going to die fairly soon, okay, of old age. So it was increasingly likely. And if that were to happen, the Weimar Constitution, which is still there, ticking away in the background, says there would need to be new presidential elections. And Hitler's worried that if he doesn't sort out this problem of the SA, the conservative elites who surround the president and who are increasingly disappointed about Hitler, who's been very indecisive, and why has he not sorted out this SA problem yet, that the conservative elites might put forward their own candidate to oppose Hitler in the presidential elections, because there will have to be another election if Hindenburg dies. And they may put forward their own candidate. Who knows who it could be? They could bring back the Kaiser, for example. The Kaiser's gone into exile. The Kaiser from 1919. An old member of an old German royal family. They may put forward their own candidate who's in the elections, and that's worrying Hitler. Okay, because he doesn't want to have to stand in an election against another candidate who could possibly beat him. So Hitler realised the best way to resolve this problem was to sort out the SA threat, because if he sorts out the SA threat, it'll make the conservatives happy, and so when Hindenburg dies, the conservatives won't put forward their own candidate to become a new president. Okay, so by doing this, Hitler could become, president himself. I shouldn't say Hitler himself, but without having to go to a presidential election, because he's going to have the full backing of the conservatives. So that's why the issue of Hindenburg's health was important. That's our next strand. Now, here's a diagram we've looked at time and again in our lessons, and I've tried to summarise here, which is quite useful. So spend a little bit of time looking at this slide, just get your head around it. And it's making that point. Remember, Hitler was not yet the complete dictator. Okay, everything in red here are the aspects of the old Weimar Constitution that have been brought under Nazi control. So the Reichstag here, okay, that had been made an irrelevance by the passing of the Enabling Act way back in March 1933. The Bill of Rights of the Weimar Constitution, civil liberties, that had been sorted out by the Reichstag fire decree that took away the civil rights of the people. Okay, the powers of the regional states, that had been sorted out by the law for the reconstruction of the Reich of the 30th of January 1934. Okay, the Enabling Act also gave powers to coordinate the Supreme Court there. Okay, the law for the construction of the Reich also abolished the upper house of the German parliament, the one that represented the different states. Okay, because it abolished the powers of the states. So that's all the red bits. Hitler was now all powerful, but with one exception. What was the exception? The position of president. That had not been sorted. The position of president, elected by the people every 7 years, had the power to dissolve the Reichstag, had the right to appoint the Chancellor, which meant dismiss the Chancellor, and was supreme commander of the army. So Hitler was not yet complete dictator, because he did not control the German army, and he could be removed from office by Hindenburg. Okay, so that's where it all sort of like is coming to a head now. And Hindenburg is the ultimate conservative, okay, surrounded by people like von Papen and the army generals, who up to now have liked Hitler, who've pushed Hitler into power and who've backed everything Hitler's been doing. But now these conservatives who've got a really close ear on the conservative, on Hindenburg, they can influence Hindenburg. These conservatives are now, there's a risk that it could all fall apart for Hitler at this final moment. And Hitler does not want to go to war against the German army. He doesn't want to end up in conflict with them because he needs them. So The army leaders served President Hindenburg, and the army was the one organisation that could therefore unseat Hitler from his position in power. Okay. Now, you could say, well, the army is only 100,000 men, which it was. It was limited by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and the SA are 2.5 million men. Okay, so the SA is, what, 25 times bigger than the German army. So if it came to a standoff between the army and the SA would win. But then what would Hitler be left with? He'd be left with a mass army of thugs. And he can't use that to invade Poland in 10 years' time. He needs the professional Prussian-German army. Okay, so there's our first point. The army leaders served President Hindenburg. The one organisation that could see. In the long term, though, Hitler needs the army more than he needs the SA. And again, I keep emphasising, we're going to start using the word Reichswehr now. It's, again, good A-level historians should use the proper word. So the Reichswehr, in other words, the Prussian, tightly knit group of Prussians, the generals who run the German army, the Reichswehr alone possessed the military skills and experience that's vital to the success of Hitler's long-term foreign policy aims: eastward expansion, war against Russia, living space, etc. And in addition, in the medium term, Hitler's main priority is to rebuild Germany's economy, create jobs for the 6 million unemployed, industry to make weapons, for Germany to become self-sufficient, so that in a future war Germany will not fall victim to a blockade as happened in the First World War. So economic recovery requires industry to be run by experienced businessmen. And here you've got the stormtroopers, as I used that allusion a few minutes ago, the stormtroopers want to take over the running of the business world themselves. Well, the stormtroopers do not have expertise. They are uneducated thugs. They don't understand economies. They don't understand business practice. And yet what Rome wants is he wants these stormtroopers to take over the running of the business world. Well, you're not going to get job creation. You're not going to get the production of weapons, if that happens, in Hitler's mind. So Hitler, therefore, understandably, is reluctant to deal with the problem of Rome's call for a second revolution. So why and how do we know he was reluctant? Well, Rome was Hitler's oldest and most loyal friend. The SA consisted of 2.5 million loyal fighters, many of whom had been with Hitler since the early 1920s. So Hitler delayed making a decision for more than a year. Okay, in a sense, you can understand his reluctance. Okay, these are his loyalist fighters. These people have been with him way back since the very beginning of the Nazi movement. Okay, so we've got that sort of key thing. Hitler was indecisive. He dragged it out for a long time. Well, we can see the evidence of that. So, for example, he offered Rome a position in his cabinet, tried to basically bribe him into being cooperative. Didn't work. Rome continued complaining. In February 1934, Hitler actually tried to bring Rome and the leaders of the army together into a meeting to get them to talk about it over the table. Didn't work. Okay, Rome was inflexible. So that's why the problem sat there for a whole. But then when Hindenburg's health began to fail in the spring of 1934, that forced Hitler to make a decision. So that failing health, in a sense, was a trigger. He couldn't delay much longer because otherwise events will force Hitler's hand, and suddenly he'll have a president has died and there'll need to be a presidential election, and the Conservatives will put forward their own candidate, and suddenly, whoa, Hitler doesn't want to go down that particular line. Okay, so that's when Hitler clearly began to realise the best thing to do is to sort out Rome. I've got to basically make that decision. And so reluctantly he reached that decision, because in effect Hitler suddenly became terrified of what could happen if President Hindenburg were to die before the problem of the SA were resolved. In theory, if Hindenburg died, Hitler would have to stand for election for the position of president. And if that were to happen, Hitler's conservative allies might oppose Hitler by putting forward their own candidate. If Hitler could persuade the Conservatives and Reichswehr leaders that he alone was the best person to take on the position of, Germany, the position of president, that should be, there, he could become president without an election. The Reichswehr leaders and Conservatives wanted the SA leadership to be eliminated. The best way for Hitler to win their support was therefore to act on what they wanted. Okay. So there we finished that fourth strand. Okay, so we're building up our picture. So we've just got one element left, which is the key play. So we've now reached the Knight of the Long Knives. Okay, I'm not going to spend long on this one because our next lesson on Wednesday will begin with this strand. But in a nutshell, who did Hitler use as his executioners on the Knight of the Long Knives? Well, the key players were two ambitious Nazis, Hermann Goering and in particular Heinrich Himmler. They were very keen, working behind the scenes, to persuade Hitler to have Ernst Röhm removed. Okay, so it wasn't just the Conservatives who wanted to have the SA leadership sorted out, but there were people within Hitler's own movement who also wanted to persuade Hitler to sort this out, but they had their own different reasons. Okay, because if the power of the SA were nipped in the bud, that would open the way to increase their own personal influence in Hitler's Third Reich. So these important people were influencing Hitler for selfish reasons. Okay, so Goering and Himmler persuaded Hitler to have Röhm and the SA leaders murdered. Okay, now Himmler in particular, Himmler was the leader of the black-shirted SS. Okay, now the black-shirted SS stands for Schutzstaffel, protection squads, bodyguards. Okay, so the SS were Hitler's personal bodyguards. Relatively small group, approximately 3,000. Okay, they had expanded. Originally, when they were formed, there were 200 of them. By about this stage, in the summer of 34, there were about 3,000 of them. In comparison to the SA, the brown shirts, which are 2.5 million, a very small group, but very, very tightly organised and very, very loyal to Hitler because they were Hitler's bodyguard. We'll do more about the SS as we move on. The SS was actually a small sub-organisation within the SA. In other words, Ernst Röhm was Himmler's boss. Okay, so that actually means that on the Night of the Long Knives, Himmler was actually ordering the murder of his own boss. Okay, because the SS were the executioners who had Röhm murdered and the SA leaders murdered. Okay, so the actual executioners were Himmler's black shirts, the SS. Okay, one final point, and then we're finished, is the vehicles that carried the SS executioners to the places of execution. Incidentally, it happened in the evening, and the SA were actually on holiday. They were on leave on the 30th of June 1934. Most of the SA leaders were living it up in sort of German holiday resorts, in hotels, etc. So the places of execution were sort of like luxury hotels. Another feature of the SA leadership, including Röhm himself, was that many of the SA leaders were homosexuals. That was part of when we talked about the excessive behaviour that the Conservatives didn't like. It was a well-known fact that the SA leaders lived a pretty excessive lifestyle that did not really fit with the standards of the day. And that included the sort of homosexual lifestyle of the SA leaders. And so on that particular evening, when the SS burst into the hotels and had the stormtroopers taken out of their bedrooms, well, I don't need to sort of like go into the sort of details, but you can imagine the sort of scenes there. But if you read the books, it reads like an amazing thriller, basically, and how they were taken out into the courtyard and they were just literally shot on the spot, including Ernst Röhm. So it basically means that the senior non-Nazi Prussian army generals were complicit in the murders that took place on the Night of the Long Knives, and we'll pick up the significance of that in the next lesson, why that was significant. Okay, so there's some pictures. There is Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS. Fairly innocuous looking guy. He was a chicken farmer in his background, very typical lower middle class. Goering, actually, Hermann Goering, fairly unusually for the Nazi leadership, was actually from the upper class, or he was. His wife was a Swedish woman, I think. I think she was Swedish upper class, but he had lots of upper class connections, and that always made Hitler useful. But he was a very, very ruthless and ambitious person. And this guy here, the bottom right, that's Blomberg. Now Blomberg was Hitler's Minister of Defence. He joined the Nazi Party in the summer of 1933, but he was not really at heart a Nazi. He was a conservative. But remember, it was his organisation, the army, that provided the trucks on the Night of the Long Knives. Okay, so again, there's just the sort of information. So Goering, Himmler, they were acting by purely selfish reasons. They wanted to expand their own power bases. The SS were the executioners, but also the Reichswehr leaders themselves. Although they were not Nazis, they were complicit. They provided the weapons and the transport on that particular night, and we'll pick that up, the significance of that, in the next lesson. There's Himmler, the leader of the SS. So in the next lesson, we will then look forward. Okay, we'll look at the outcome, the consequences in our next lesson. So there we are. Okay, we've covered that big story, but there's our mind map. Okay, with all the information. Hopefully you've now mapped that out onto your own mind map, the key facts for that. And that's the end of this particular lesson. Hopefully that was useful for you, and that's the lesson for today. And Wednesday's lesson, then we will look at the significance of the Night of the Long Knives. Just a reminder for the sort of casual reader or listener who's playing this video, but also if in future years this video is being played by any of my own future students. This was recorded in the summer of the summer of or the spring of 2020, when Britain was in lockdown because of the pandemic, which is why we've got online lessons at this point in time. I'll stop this now. Thank you very much.